Let's start with something that might make some people in this room uncomfortable. Because the moment you truly understand what a super empath is capable of, not the romanticized, soft-edged version that gets posted on social media, but the real version, the fully developed, psychologically integrated version, you begin to realize that what we've been calling sensitivity is actually something far more formidable than that word suggests. Most people think of empathy as a passive quality, a receptive quality, something that happens to a person rather than something a person does. And for the average empath, that's partially true. They feel deeply, they absorb the emotional atmosphere of a room, they're affected by the energy of the people around them in ways that can be both beautiful and exhausting. But a super empath, someone who has taken that innate sensitivity and forged it through years of self-awareness, psychological growth, and hard-won experience, operates on an entirely different level. Their empathy is not passive, it is active. It is not reactive, it is precise. Here is what that means in practice. When a super empath walks into a room, they are not simply picking up on how people feel. They are reading the gap between what people say and what people mean. They are tracking micro-expressions, tonal inconsistencies, the slight hesitation before an answer that came just a half second too quickly. They notice the person whose words express confidence but whose body language communicates fear. They notice the smile that reaches the mouth but never quite makes it to the eyes. They notice the generosity that has a subtle agenda threaded through it, the compliment that carries a barely concealed barb, the apology that is structured, if you listen carefully enough, to actually reassign blame rather than accept it. This is not intuition in the mystical sense, though it can feel that way from the outside. What it actually is at its core is an extraordinarily calibrated form of pattern recognition. The super empath has encountered enough human behavior and has been wounded enough by the discrepancy between what people present and who they actually are that their nervous system has essentially built an internal lie detector. Not a perfect one, not an infallible one, but one that is accurate enough and fast enough to make deception an almost impossible game to sustain in their presence. Now think about what this means for someone who relies on masks. Think about what this means for the manipulator, the narcissist, the person who has built their entire social strategy around controlling perception, around presenting a curated version of themselves that serves their agenda while concealing their actual motivations. These individuals move through the world largely unchallenged, because most people are too distracted, too trusting, or too conflict-averse to call out what they sense but cannot quite name. But the super empath doesn't need to name it out loud to know it. They feel the falseness the moment it enters their space, and that knowing, that quiet, unshakable internal recognition fundamentally changes the dynamic, because you cannot manipulate someone who has already seen through you. You cannot gaslight someone whose internal compass is more reliable than your narrative. You cannot destabilize someone who felt the tremor beneath your foundation before you even opened your mouth. The mask, which has worked on everyone else, simply does not work here. And for the person wearing it, that is a deeply disorienting experience, the sudden, unsettling sense that they are being seen in a way they never consented to and cannot control. This is why the super empath's greatest power has nothing to do with confrontation, nothing to do with aggression, and everything to do with perception. They don't need to expose you. Simply being in their presence, fully seen and fully known, is exposure enough. The most dangerous thing you can do to a person who lives behind a mask is to look at them, really look, and let them know, without a single word, that you already see exactly what's underneath it. Now that you understand how the super empath sees, how that extraordinary perceptual precision operates beneath the surface of every interaction, I want to take you one level deeper. Because seeing clearly is only the beginning. What the super empath does with what they see is where things become truly remarkable. And for anyone who has ever made the mistake of treating a super empath as an easy target, as someone whose sensitivity makes them exploitable, this is the part that changes everything. There is a concept in physics called resonance. When one vibrating object encounters another object capable of vibrating at the same frequency, something extraordinary happens. The second object doesn't just respond to the first, it amplifies it. The energy doesn't simply transfer, it compounds. And this is precisely the mechanism at work when a super empath engages with the emotional energy of the people around them. They don't just receive what you're putting out. They resonate with it at a frequency so precise, so deeply attuned, that what comes back is not an echo, it is an amplification. That for most people, this quality in the super empath feels like being deeply understood. It feels like finally being in the presence of someone who genuinely gets you, who reflects your joy back with more color, your pain back with more compassion, your enthusiasm back with more electricity than you expected. This is the gift side of the equation, and it is real, but it is only half the picture. Because the same mechanism that amplifies warmth and authenticity amplifies something else entirely when what is being brought into the super empath space is toxic, manipulative, or emotionally dishonest. When a narcissist attempts to project their dysfunction onto a super empath, when they bring their manipulation, their emotional games, their carefully constructed provocations designed to create insecurity and self-doubt, the super empath does something the narcissist has almost never encountered before. They absorb the energy, yes, but they do not keep it. They do not internalize it as truth. They do not collapse under the weight of it the way the narcissist expects. Instead, having processed it through the filter of their extraordinary self-awareness, they reflect it back, cleanly, precisely, with a clarity that strips away all the sophisticated packaging and returns the energy to its sender in its purest, most undeniable form. This is what I mean when I say the super empath mirrors with precision. It is not a conscious performance. It is not a calculated strategy deployed with cold intention. It is something far more organic than that, a natural consequence of being someone who processes emotional reality at a depth most people never reach. The toxic person, confronted with the reflection of their own behavior in someone who refuses to absorb it as their own, suddenly finds themselves face to face with something they have spent their entire lives running from, an accurate picture of who they actually are. And here is where the danger truly lives, because that reflection does not require a raised voice. It does not require accusation or confrontation or dramatic revelation. The super empath doesn't need to say, "I see what you're doing and I want you to know it." Their presence alone communicates it. The calmness with which they receive what was designed to wound them. The steadiness with which they hold their own narrative in the face of someone trying to rewrite it. The quiet refusal to become destabilized that communicates, more powerfully than any words could, that the game being played here is already over because one player refuses to participate in it. This is the thing about emotional mastery that most people fundamentally misunderstand. They think power in relationships looks like dominance, like aggression, like the loudest voice or the most cutting words. But real power, the kind that genuinely unsettles people who rely on manipulation, looks like stillness. It looks like someone who cannot be moved from their own truth regardless of the pressure applied. And in the hands of a super empath who has done the deep inner work, that stillness becomes something extraordinary. It becomes a force that doesn't push back so much as it renders the push irrelevant. Think about what it means to bring your most sophisticated manipulation to someone and have it returned to you. Not with anger, not with tears, not with the satisfying reaction you were engineering, but with a calm, grounded, almost compassionate acknowledgement that says, "I felt that, I understood exactly what it was, and it didn't find what it was looking for here." That is not just resistance, that is mastery. And for someone whose entire sense of control depends on being able to provoke a reaction, there is nothing more disorienting, nothing more threatening, than meeting someone in whom that reaction simply does not exist. When you can no longer control someone's reaction, you have lost every lever of power you ever had over them, and the super empath figured that out long before you arrived. There is a myth that needs to be dismantled right now. The myth so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the way we talk about sensitive people, that it has caused an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering and strategic miscalculation. The myth is this: that sensitivity and strength are opposites. That the more deeply a person feels, the more vulnerable they are to being broken. That empathy, by its very nature, is a structural weakness in the architecture of a person's psychology. And nowhere is this myth more dangerous or more wrong than when it is applied to the super empath. I want you to think about how this misconception plays out in real dynamics. The narcissist, the emotional manipulator, the energy vampire, these individuals are, at their core, predatory in a very specific and calculated way. They are not indiscriminate. They do not target people randomly. They select. And what they select for, almost without exception, is the combination of high emotional sensitivity and what they perceive to be insufficient boundaries. They are drawn to the empath's warmth, their capacity for compassion, their willingness to see the best in people and extend grace even when it hasn't been earned. And in the ordinary empath, that combination can indeed create vulnerability, a tendency to overgive, to excuse behavior that should not be excused, to absorb blame that was never theirs to carry. So when the predatory personality first encounters the super empath, they make a very understandable but ultimately catastrophic error in judgment. They see the sensitivity and they assume the weakness. They see the compassion and they mistake it for naivety. They see the warmth and they interpret it as an open door. What they do not see, what they cannot see from the outside, at least not immediately, is what that sensitivity is built upon. They don't see the foundation. And the foundation of the super empath is not soft. It is not pliable. It is not available for reconstruction according to someone else's agenda. It is, in the most precise psychological sense of the word, unbreakable. How does that unbreakable core develop? It doesn't arrive fully formed. It is not a gift that some people are born with and others are not. It is forged. It is built through experience, specifically through the experience of having been broken open, of having been through the kind of emotional devastation that would cause most people to either shut down completely or lose themselves entirely in someone else's reality. The super empath has been through the fire. They have been manipulated, gaslighted, emotionally exhausted, and psychologically destabilized, often by someone they loved deeply and trusted completely. And instead of emerging from that experience hardened and closed, they emerged from it clarified. They learned at a cellular level the difference between genuine connection and sophisticated exploitation. They learned where their boundaries needed to live. They learned that their empathy, as profound and beautiful as it is, was never meant to be offered without discernment. This is the critical distinction that the manipulator never anticipates. They expect the super empath to behave like every other sensitive person they've encountered, to gradually absorb the narrative being constructed for them, to begin doubting their own perception, to become smaller and more manageable over time as the psychological pressure accumulates. But the super empath's inner core operates like an immune system that has already encountered this particular pathogen. It recognizes it. It doesn't panic in its presence. It doesn't negotiate with it. It simply, methodically, and without drama rejects it, and the rejection is not loud. That is perhaps the most confounding thing for the person who expected to find a soft target. There is no explosion. There is no breakdown. There is no moment of dramatic confrontation that at least provides the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, there is something far more unnerving, a quiet, steady, almost serene refusal to be moved. A person who listens to the manipulation without absorbing it, who hears the reframing without accepting it, who receives the provocation without producing the response it was designed to generate, who looks at the entire sophisticated architecture of the psychological game being played and simply, calmly, does not participate. For someone whose power depends entirely on the other person's willingness to engage with the dynamic they've constructed, this is not just frustrating. It is destabilizing in a way that cuts to the very core of their identity, because the manipulator's sense of control, their sense of self, their entire psychological framework, is built on the premise that they can shape other people's reality. And the super empath is living, breathing daily proof that they cannot. Not here, not with this person. The tools don't work. The strategies don't land. The pressure finds no purchase. And eventually, in the face of that immovable inner stillness, the only thing left to do is leave, which is, of course, exactly what the super empath was waiting for all along. Sensitivity was never the weakness they thought it was in the hands of someone who has survived the worst and chosen growth over bitterness. It becomes the most impenetrable armor in existence. Everything we've discussed so far has been building towards something. The seeing through masks, the precise reflection of toxic energy, the unbreakable inner core. Each of these qualities, as powerful as they are individually, produces a combined effect that is perhaps the most profound and the most unsettling thing about the super empath. And it is this: simply being in their presence changes people. Not through anything they deliberately do, not through advice they dispense or wisdom they perform, but through something far more primal, far more immediate, and far more difficult to defend against than any conscious intervention could ever be. The super empath, by virtue of who they are, the depth of their authenticity, the completeness of their self-awareness, the radical honesty with which they inhabit their own experience, functions as a mirror of extraordinary clarity and zero distortion. And when people encounter that mirror, when they spend real time in the presence of someone who is genuinely, uncomplicatedly themselves, not performing, not managing perception, not carefully curating which parts of their inner world are visible, something happens inside them that they often cannot immediately name. They feel seen, and simultaneously, almost paradoxically, they feel exposed. For psychologically healthy people, this experience is nothing short of transformative. Think about what it means to be in the presence of someone who has no agenda, no mask, no carefully maintained persona that needs protecting. Someone whose warmth is real, whose boundaries are clear, whose responses come from a place of genuine inner alignment rather than social calculation. For the person who has been navigating a world full of performance and pretense, this kind of authentic presence is like oxygen after a long time in a room with too little air. It gives them permission. Permission to drop their own performance. Permission to be uncertain, to be vulnerable, to be human in a way that the relentless social theater of modern life rarely allows. The super empath doesn't just inspire growth in these people, they catalyze it. They create the conditions in which growth becomes not just possible but almost inevitable. Because genuine authenticity, when encountered up close, has a way of making everything false feel unbearable by comparison. But now turn that same mirror towards someone who is not psychologically healthy. Turn it towards someone whose entire identity is constructed rather than discovered, someone who has spent years, perhaps decades, building an elaborate internal and external architecture designed to keep the truth of who they are at a safe and manageable distance. For this person, the super empath's presence does not feel like oxygen. It feels like a threat, a profound, disorienting, almost existential threat, because the mirror doesn't lie. It doesn't soften the reflection out of politeness or social convenience. It shows exactly what is there, and what is there for the person who has been running from themselves is something they have invested everything in, never having to see clearly. This is why toxic personalities, narcissists, manipulators, emotionally arrested individuals of every variety react to the super empath with such disproportionate intensity. What looks from the outside like a simple interpersonal conflict is actually something far more psychologically complex. It is the collision between radical authenticity and radical self-deception. And radical self-deception, when it encounters a mirror it cannot cloud, cannot tilt, cannot shatter, does not respond with curiosity or humility. It responds with aggression, with attempts to discredit the mirror, with campaigns to convince everyone around them, and themselves most urgently of all, that the reflection they're seeing is distorted, that the problem is the mirror, not what the mirror is showing. But here is the thing about shame that psychology has understood for a long time, and that most people still underestimate in their daily lives. Shame is not a passive emotion. It does not sit quietly in a corner and wait to be processed. Unexamined shame is one of the most activating forces in human psychology. It drives behavior, shapes relationships, and generates defensive aggression with a ferocity that is completely disproportionate to whatever surface-level conflict appears to be happening. When the toxic person attacks the super empath, when they attempt to diminish them, discredit them, or destroy their reputation in the eyes of others, they are not responding to anything the super empath has done. They are responding to what the super empath has revealed, not through accusation, not through confrontation, but simply through the unbearable clarity of being genuinely, unapologetically themselves in a way that makes every performance look exactly like what it is. And the healthy people watching this dynamic, the ones who have felt that transformative pull of the super empath's authentic presence, they notice something. They notice the disproportion of the reaction. They notice the aggression that arrived without adequate cause. They notice that the person doing the attacking seems far more invested in the destruction than the original conflict warrants. And in noticing that, they learn something about both parties that no explicit revelation could have taught them as efficiently or as permanently. Authenticity doesn't need to announce itself, it simply stands in the room, and everything false in the vicinity begins, quietly and inevitably, to collapse under the weight of the contrast. We have arrived at what I believe is the most misunderstood quality of the super empath, the one that surprises people the most, the one that frankly does the most damage to those who never saw it coming. Because everything we've discussed so far, the perception, the reflection, the unbreakable core, the mirror that inspires or destroys, all of it has been building toward this single, defining moment. The moment the super empath decides they are done. And when that moment arrives, it arrives completely. Let me paint the picture that most people are familiar with, because context matters here. In the typical dynamic between an empath and a toxic personality, there is a cycle. The empath gives, the toxic person takes. The boundaries get pushed, the energy gets drained, the manipulation escalates incrementally, always just enough to maintain the relationship, never quite enough to force an immediate reckoning. And the empath, whose entire psychological orientation is built around compassion and the genuine belief in people's capacity for change, absorbs it. They excuse it, they reframe it. They have the conversation again, extend the grace again, offer the benefit of the doubt again. Because at their core, they are someone who believes deeply in the fundamental goodness of people and cannot easily reconcile that belief with the evidence accumulating in front of them. This is the phase that toxic personalities depend on. This extended middle period where the empath's compassion functions as a renewable resource that can be repeatedly drawn upon without consequence, where each transgression is eventually forgiven, each boundary violation eventually absorbed, each apology, however hollow, eventually accepted. It is comfortable territory for the manipulator, familiar, predictable. They have been here before with others and they know how it tends to go. What they do not know, what they have fundamentally failed to understand about the person they are dealing with, is that beneath all of that patience, beneath all of that grace and compassion and willingness to extend chance after chance, there is a threshold, not a dramatic one, not one that announces itself in advance or gives warning signs that the end is approaching. Just a threshold. A quiet internal line that exists in every super empath, drawn not in anger or resentment, but in something far more permanent than either of those emotions drawn in clarity. The moment that line is crossed, something shifts inside the super empath that does not shift back. Something that was open closes. Something that was accessible becomes permanently, irrevocably unavailable. And no amount of charm, remorse, grand gestures, or sophisticated re-engagement strategies will reverse what has happened in that interior moment. This is what people mean when they talk about the super empath's departure being total. It is not a negotiating position. It is not a dramatic exit designed to provoke pursuit. It is not the kind of leaving that contains a hidden invitation to follow. It is the natural conclusion of a process that has been running quietly beneath the surface of the relationship for longer than anyone realized, a process of accumulation, of documentation, of the slow and patient building of a case that the super empath never intended to build, but that their extraordinary perceptual capacity built almost automatically. Every dismissal was noted. Every manipulation was catalogued. Every moment of deliberate cruelty disguised as a joke. Every boundary pushed and then pushed again. Every apology that changed nothing, all of it stored, not in bitterness, but in knowing. And when the knowing reaches its natural conclusion, the decision it produces is not emotional. It is surgical. The silence that follows is what undoes people. Because the toxic personality, who has relied throughout this entire dynamic on the empath's emotional responsiveness, on their willingness to engage, to react, to re-enter the conversation, however painful, suddenly finds themselves facing something they have no strategy for. Genuine indifference. Not the performed indifference of someone who is secretly still invested and hoping you'll notice. Not the punishing silence of someone who wants you to feel their absence. But the real thing, the profound, settled, almost peaceful quiet of someone who has fully completed their relationship with you in the interior of their own being and no longer requires anything from the external version of events to confirm what they already know. You cannot negotiate with that silence. You cannot charm your way back through it. You cannot manufacture enough urgency or remorse or transformation to reach someone who has already completely and without residual ambiguity let go. The door is not closed and locked. It simply no longer exists. And for someone whose entire sense of power has been built on the ability to re-access people, to pull them back into the dynamic whenever it suits them, to rely on the emotional connection as a lever that is always available, discovering that the lever has been permanently removed is not just a loss. It is a confrontation with their own limitations that they were never prepared to face. The world will tell you that the empath is the vulnerable one in these dynamics, that their sensitivity makes them susceptible, their compassion makes them exploitable, their capacity for love makes them the inevitable loser in encounters with people who do not share those qualities. And for a time in the early and middle stages of these dynamics, that assessment can look accurate from the outside. But the ending, the real ending, the one that the super empath authors entirely on their own terms, tells a completely different story. The most devastating thing a super empath can do to someone who underestimated them is nothing at all, because the silence of someone who has truly moved on says everything that words never could. We have traveled a remarkable distance together in this conversation. We have dismantled the myth of sensitivity as weakness. We have explored the extraordinary perceptual precision of the super empath, the way they absorb and reflect energy with surgical accuracy, the unbreakable core that confounds everyone who mistakes their compassion for fragility, the mirror effect that transforms the healthy and exposes the toxic, and the total, permanent, unutterably powerful departure that leaves no door for negotiation. And now we arrive at the final piece, the one that ties everything together, the one that explains at the deepest level not just what the super empath does, but what they ultimately become. And it begins with the most important question we could ask about any human being: what do you do with your pain? Because pain is universal. Suffering is the one experience that cuts across every boundary of culture, personality, privilege, and circumstance. Every person in this room, every person watching, every person who has ever drawn breath on this planet has known what it is to be hurt, to be betrayed, to be diminished, to be broken open by life in ways they did not choose and did not deserve. The question was never whether the pain would come. The question has always been what happens after. What you do with the wreckage. Whether the wound becomes a wall or a window. Whether the experience of being broken makes you smaller or, somehow, against all apparent logic, makes you more. The super empath, almost without exception, has a history. And it is rarely a gentle one. These are not people who developed their extraordinary emotional depth in comfortable, unchallenging circumstances. They developed it in the fire, in the relationships that cost them more than they should have given, in the betrayals that rewired their understanding of trust, in the long, disorienting periods of self-doubt that followed encounters with people who were skilled at making them question their own perception of reality, in the grief of loving someone deeply and discovering that the person they loved was, in fundamental ways, a construction, a performance designed to access something rather than to genuinely connect with someone. These experiences are not minor. They are not the kind of thing you simply recover from and move on. They are the kind of thing that either destroys you or defines you. And for the super empath, they become the raw material of something extraordinary. The psychological term for this is post-traumatic growth. The idea, supported by decades of research, that human beings are not just capable of surviving adversity, but of being genuinely, measurably transformed by it in ways that expand their capacity, their wisdom, and their resilience beyond what was possible before the adversity occurred. But the super empath takes this process further than most, because they don't just grow from their pain in the general sense of becoming more resilient or more cautious or more self-protective. They alchemize it. They take the specific nature of what they suffered, the manipulation they endured, the gaslighting they survived, the emotional exhaustion of loving someone who was incapable of genuine reciprocity, and they transmute it into the precise set of capabilities that makes them so formidable. Every experience of being deceived sharpens the perception that now sees through deception instantly. Every experience of having their reality rewritten by someone else deepens the self-knowledge that now makes their inner narrative impervious to external manipulation. Every experience of giving too much to someone who took without gratitude clarifies the discernment that now governs exactly where and how their extraordinary capacity for love is directed. This is the alchemy. This is what separates the super empath from someone who simply suffered and survived. The suffering didn't just leave scars, it left skills. The wounds didn't just close, they closed around something harder and more valuable than what was there before. And the result is a human being whose wisdom is not theoretical, not academic, not assembled from books and seminars and secondhand understanding. It is lived, it is embodied. It is the kind of knowing that cannot be faked or shortcut or acquired any other way than by going through exactly what they went through and choosing. At every available junction, growth over bitterness, self-awareness over victimhood, expansion over contraction. And this is perhaps the most dangerous thing of all about the super empath, in the most profound and beautiful sense of that word, because they don't just carry their wisdom privately, they radiate it. It lives in how they show up in every room, every relationship, every conversation. It lives in the quality of presence they bring, that particular combination of warmth and groundedness and perceptual depth that makes people feel simultaneously completely seen and completely safe. It lives in the standard they hold, quietly but absolutely, for how they are treated and what they are willing to participate in. And it lives in the example they set, the living, breathing, daily demonstration that it is possible to have been through the worst of what human relationships can produce and to have emerged not hardened, not closed, not diminished, but more capable, more knowing, more fully, magnificently, unapologetically alive. The world needs more people who have done this work, that have refused the easier path of shutting down, building walls, deciding that the pain of the past is sufficient reason to close off the possibilities of the future. The super empath chose the harder path, the path of feeling everything. Understanding everything, surviving everything, and using everything in that choice, made over and over again in the private interior of their own becoming, is the source of every quality we have discussed today. Your deepest wound and your greatest power are not opposites, they are the same thing. Seen from different sides of the transformation you were brave enough to walk through.